They told me my ranch didn't belong to me. That's right, my own property, in my name, was suddenly community property, according to the HOA. Overnight, letters arrived, fines piled up, and strangers were making rules about my life, my land, my freedom. Every call I made was met with cold bureaucracy and thinly veiled threats. I tried to fight back, but they had power over everything. Or so they thought. And then, just before the first freeze of the season, I made a move that would shock them, and everyone in the neighborhood. What happens when someone finally pushes back against an HOA that's gone too far? 4 years, life on my ranch had been simple, almost idyllic. Mornings were spent with coffee in hand, watching the sun spill over the rolling fields. My dogs would roam freely, and the kids played where the grass was thick and green. Our house wasn't extravagant, but it was ours, a place where birthdays, holidays, and ordinary evenings felt sacred. The neighbors waved from across the street, small talk drifting like the wind through the oaks. I liked the quiet. I liked the freedom. We were part of the Hillside Estates Homeowners Association, a group I had never given much thought to beyond the occasional newsletter or community cleanup. Rules were rules, I'd always thought, and as long as everyone followed them, life moved smoothly. But over time, small things began to creep in. Letters about minor infractions, strange new policies that seemed to pop up out of nowhere, and meetings that dragged on with heated debates over things that felt absurdly trivial. At first, it was easy to ignore. A fence slightly taller than regulations allowed, a mailbox that didn't match the community-approved style, petty nuisances that most people would roll their eyes at. But there was a pattern, a quiet, persistent pressure that made the neighborhood feel less like home and more like a controlled stage. And then, one morning, I received the notice that changed everything. According to the HOA, my ranch, my land, my property, was now community property. No explanation, no discussion, just a declaration that my autonomy was gone. I felt my blood run cold. How could they claim ownership over the place where my family had built our lives? Where every scratch on the floor, every tree we planted, every morning sunrise we watched was ours. I knew then that the fight ahead wouldn't just be about fences or mailboxes. It would be about control, pride, and justice. And I had no intention of letting a bureaucratic group of strangers take that away from me. The first official notice hit my mailbox like a hammer. The HOA had reviewed my property and decided, without explanation, that my land fell under community oversight. It wasn't just a suggestion, they demanded changes immediately. The fence, the landscaping, even the placement of my garden shed was suddenly subject to approval. I stared at the letter, disbelief mixing with anger. My ranch, the place where every nail and tree was ours, was now somehow up for debate. I tried to reason with them at first. Emails, calls, politely asking for clarification. But every reply was a carefully worded dodge, a bureaucratic dance that left me more frustrated than before. The board members didn't engage. They simply reminded me of community standards and the legal consequences of noncompliance. Fines appeared almost overnight. Small amounts at first, a few $100s here, a few hundred there. But they piled up faster than I could pay. Letters arrived with official-looking stamps and threatening language, and suddenly, my mail felt like a countdown clock, each one a reminder that my control over my own home was slipping. Neighbors began to notice. Some whispered, unsure whether to side with me or the HOA. Others stared openly, as if my struggle was a spectacle meant to entertain. I could feel eyes on me during my morning walks, during visits to the local store. It wasn't just about the property anymore. It was personal. I was under scrutiny, and the HOA wielded their authority like a cudgel, subtle yet terrifying. Then came the inspections. Men in polos with clipboards appeared unannounced, walking through my property as if they had a right to be there. I asked them to leave. They quoted regulations, pointing to obscure clauses buried in the bylaws no one had ever explained to me. Every conversation ended with thinly veiled threats of larger fines, legal action, or even liens against my property. Sleep became impossible. I could feel the walls closing in, the serenity of my ranch replaced with anxiety that gnawed at every quiet moment. I started documenting everything: emails, letters, photos of my property before and after inspections. I thought maybe if I had proof, I could push back. But the HOA wasn't just persistent, they were creative. One week, I received a notice claiming my garden shed blocked a community easement, although it had stood in the same spot for 5 years without issue. Another day, I was fined for excessive lawn height, despite mowing weekly. Each infraction felt arbitrary, and each fine added to the weight pressing on my chest. Then the neighbors' subtle hostility escalated. A once friendly couple next door started reporting trivial violations: the wrong kind of flowers in my front bed, my driveway slightly cracked, my trash cans placed incorrectly. I could almost feel the HOA rubbing their hands together as they collected these reports, using them as fuel to tighten their grip. The ranch I had loved so dearly began to feel like a cage. I walked the perimeter daily, checking for anything that could possibly trigger a new complaint, my sense of calm evaporating under the constant tension. Late one night, I found a particularly audacious letter slipped under my door. The HOA had reviewed my winter preparedness plan and deemed my heating setup non-compliant with community standards. Non-compliant? My furnace was brand new, efficient, and fully functional. But the letter didn't care about logic, it was designed to intimidate. And it worked. The freeze was approaching, and they were daring me to defy them, to risk both comfort and safety just to make a point. I began to realize that this wasn't about rules or aesthetics. It was about control. The HOA thrived on obedience and fear. They didn't see me as a homeowner. I was a nuisance, an anomaly in a world of compliant neighbors who kept their heads down and followed orders. And the more I resisted, the more they escalated. The breaking point came when I discovered they were attempting to declare a portion of my property, my horse pasture, my workshop area, as community land. According to them, these sections were now subject to community oversight, meaning I couldn't make any decisions without approval. They had never asked, never discussed it, simply announced it as fact. I stared at the official document, a mix of fury and disbelief coursing through me. They wanted to take my land piece by piece, using the weight of bureaucracy as a weapon. I thought about neighbors I had trusted, people I had waved to in the morning and shared casual conversation with. Would they understand what was happening? Or would they see me as the troublemaker the HOA painted me to be? I felt alone, cornered, and yet a spark of defiance ignited deep inside me. If they thought I would quietly accept this theft by proxy, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. And then came the perfect storm. A sudden, unseasonable cold snap was forecast, threatening to freeze pipes and ruin crops. The HOA, indifferent to the practical realities of my ranch, had threatened additional fines if I acted without their explicit permission, even for simple winter preparation tasks. That's when I realized I had to act, and I had to act decisively. Waiting, negotiating, pleading, it wouldn't work. They needed a wake-up call, a reminder that I was not just a compliant neighbor, but a homeowner willing to fight for what was mine. I started planning carefully. Every step had to be precise, calculated. Any mistake could strengthen their case, give them legal ammunition, or turn the community further against me. But I was ready to escalate. I wouldn't let this freeze, and their control, dictate the safety and livelihood of my ranch. Little did I know, what I was about to do would shock them, shake the neighborhood, and leave the HOA scrambling in ways they never expected. The confrontation, the stakes, and the fallout were just around the corner. And when it happened, there would be no turning back. The night before the first freeze, I made my move. Every step had been calculated, every risk weighed. The HOA had overstepped one too many times, pushing the boundaries of legality, decency, and common sense. They thought their letters, fines, and inspections could intimidate me. They thought their power over electricity, permits, and minor infractions made them untouchable. They were wrong. With the cold wind cutting through the ranch, I disconnected the main power line supplying the community-owned portion of the grid that ran through my property. Not maliciously, but with precision, enough to halt the HOA's control without endangering my own home or livestock. I watched from my porch as the neighboring streetlights blinked out, as office computers powered down, and as the quiet tension of bureaucratic arrogance turned into panic. For the first time, I could see the fear in their eyes, not just annoyance, but genuine helplessness. The HOA board members arrived in a flurry, storming toward my property, shouting threats and demanding explanations. I met them calmly, letting the cold and darkness do the talking. There was no violence, no physical confrontation, just the stark reality that I had the upper hand. Their arguments dissolved into incoherent pleas. Legal jargon that had previously intimidated me suddenly sounded absurd in the empty, frozen night. 4 hours, they tried to regain control, calling electricians, threatening lawsuits, sending more letters. But the freeze was coming, and their power to harm my family or seize my land was gone. I could feel a strange exhilaration, a mix of vindication and disbelief. I wasn't just defending my property. I was reclaiming my autonomy, proving that even the most rigid, self-important bureaucracy could be outsmarted. And then, just as the first frost crept across the fields, a neighbor stepped forward. Quietly, without fanfare, they acknowledged what I had done, not in agreement or defiance, but with a nod that spoke volumes. Sometimes, the most powerful victories are not the loudest. They're the ones that leave your opponent speechless, staring at the consequences of their own hubris. By the time the sun rose, the HOA's grip had been shattered. Not legally, not yet, but emotionally, psychologically, and morally, they had lost the upper hand. I had proven that courage, preparation, and a refusal to be bullied could bend even the most entrenched powers to account. As I walked through my ranch, surveying the frost-kissed fields and the quiet houses, I realized something fundamental. Power is only as strong as those who wield it unchecked. And sometimes, it takes one person willing to stand their ground to remind everyone where the real authority lies. The morning after the power disruption, the neighborhood was silent, almost suspended in disbelief. Windows remained dark, mailboxes untouched, and even the previously vigilant neighbors seemed hesitant to break the quiet. The HOA board had retreated, their morning meeting canceled without explanation, their carefully constructed rules suddenly meaningless in the wake of the freeze and the audacity of what had occurred. I walked the property, surveying the frost-covered grass, my hands shaking, not from the cold, but from the sheer magnitude of what had just happened. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of calm return, tempered with the awareness that the fight was not yet over. Emails arrived shortly after sunrise. The HOA sent formal letters, more polite than before, acknowledging unexpected disruptions and technical complications. There were no threats this time, no veiled warnings or fines hidden in bureaucratic language. Instead, the tone had shifted. Somewhere between their panic and my unyielding stance, the balance of power had moved. I realized then that a single, decisive action, executed carefully and courageously, could not only halt immediate abuse but also shift the entire dynamic of a community long dominated by fear and conformity. Neighbors began to emerge cautiously. Some avoided eye contact, unsure of what to say, while others approached with quiet admiration. One older couple, who had previously sided openly with the HOA, stopped by with coffee and a tentative smile, acknowledging in hushed tones that my actions had been necessary. Slowly, conversations resumed, this time with an undercurrent of respect for boundaries, autonomy, and fairness. The neighborhood had changed overnight, and even those who disagreed seemed reluctant to challenge a precedent that had proven the HOA was not invincible. The legal aftermath was a slow-burning process. I anticipated lawsuits, threats, and endless meetings, but the HOA seemed reluctant to escalate. Perhaps their confidence had been shaken, or perhaps the freeze had exposed vulnerabilities they could not risk highlighting in court. Instead, they focused on dialogue, attempts at negotiation, and a sudden willingness to compromise on previously rigid rules. Every interaction felt like walking on a tightrope. I knew that maintaining authority without provoking retaliation would require careful balance, but the psychological advantage remained firmly with me. Over the following weeks, life on the ranch returned to a semblance of normalcy. The dogs ran freely, the children played under the open sky, and I no longer walked each morning with anxiety coiling in my chest. But the lessons lingered. The experience had exposed the fragility of bureaucratic authority, the absurdity of arbitrary rules, and the vulnerability of a community when fear is used as a tool of control. What once felt like a quiet, serene neighborhood had been revealed as a microcosm of power dynamics, pettiness, and manipulation. I understood, more clearly than ever, that vigilance and courage were essential, not just for myself, but for everyone who valued independence and fairness. Interestingly, the HOA itself began to transform, though not entirely by choice. Board members were replaced, policies revised, and a few previously passive residents became vocal advocates for transparency and accountability. What had started as a petty, escalating conflict evolved into a wake-up call for the entire community. The arbitrary fines, obscure rules, and invasive inspections that had once dominated life on my ranch became cautionary tales for everyone else. It was a subtle victory, but a profound one. By challenging the system, I had forced reflection, reform, and a reconsideration of power that extended far beyond my own property lines. Financially, the impact was minimal. While I had invested time, energy, and a small amount of money in preparing for the power disruption and documenting the dispute, the freeze passed without damage to my home or livestock. The HOA's attempts to assert control had been neutralized without creating collateral harm, reinforcing the idea that strategic, careful action, rather than reckless rebellion, was the most effective form of resistance. Friends and family marveled at the outcome, but I knew the real victory was subtler, reclaiming autonomy and ensuring that fear could no longer dictate the rhythm of my life. Emotionally, the journey reshaped me. I discovered reserves of patience, ingenuity, and resolve that I hadn't realized existed. The constant tension of fines, inspections, and bureaucratic interference had been exhausting, but it also sharpened my awareness of boundaries, rights, and the importance of standing firm in the face of intimidation. I began to see my home not merely as a property but as a sanctuary, a symbol of self-determination, courage, and resilience. That perspective would carry forward into every future decision, every negotiation, and every encounter with authority, whether friendly or adversarial. Community dynamics also shifted in surprising ways. Some neighbors who had once supported the HOA's heavy-handed approach began questioning their alignment. Casual conversations revealed a growing skepticism of the organization's authority, and slowly, a culture of accountability emerged. Residents began attending meetings with prepared questions, challenging obscure clauses, and insisting on transparency. The board, once confident in unchecked enforcement, was now subject to scrutiny. The fear that had permeated hillside estates was replaced, slowly but unmistakably, with a cautious respect for fairness and autonomy. Reflecting on the experience, I realized that the conflict was never really about the fence, the mailbox, or even the so-called community property. It was about the human tendency to wield power without empathy, the small injustices that accumulate until someone refuses to accept them, and the ripple effects that a single act of defiance can create. My decision to act decisively during the freeze was a catalyst, but the broader impact came from persistence, attention to detail, and the refusal to be silenced. In the months that followed, the HOA continued to exist, but its authority was tempered. I remained vigilant, attending meetings selectively, reviewing correspondence meticulously, and keeping detailed records. Yet the anxiety that once defined daily life had largely disappeared. My ranch was mine again, not just in ownership, but in spirit. The air felt lighter, the sunrise brighter, and even mundane tasks carried a sense of reclaimed freedom. It was a quiet triumph, but one that resonated deeply, proof that integrity, preparation, and courage can outweigh bureaucracy and intimidation. Looking back, I often think about the lessons that extend beyond the ranch. Systems of control, whether in neighborhoods, workplaces, or government institutions, can appear overwhelming, monolithic, and invincible. Yet every system has limits, and every individual has the capacity to challenge abuse in ways that are thoughtful, calculated, and effective. Courage does not always roar. Sometimes, it is a quiet, precise act that shifts momentum and changes the course of events for everyone involved. The story of my ranch and the HOA spread quietly through hillside estates, sparking conversations, debates, and reflections. Some celebrated the outcome openly, while others grappled with discomfort, unwilling to confront the implications of what had occurred. But the central truth remained undeniable. An individual, armed with knowledge, patience, and resolve, could confront authority and emerge victorious without compromising safety, ethics, or principles. Even now, years later, the memory of that freeze and the confrontation with the HOA carries a weight I cannot dismiss. It reminds me that boundaries are worth defending, that complacency invites overreach, and that ordinary people can produce extraordinary outcomes when circumstances demand it. Each time I walk through my ranch, see the frost glinting on the fields, or watch my family thrive in spaces we fought to preserve, I am reminded of the power of standing firm, and the subtle but profound impact that courage, strategy, and determination can have on an entire community. And so, the final takeaway emerges, clear and resolute. Property, freedom, and dignity are never simply handed over. They are claimed, defended, and preserved by those willing to act when the moment demands it. The HOA may have thought they controlled the narrative, but in the end, it was a single, steadfast homeowner who reminded everyone where true authority lies. The question that lingers, long after the frost has melted, is one I leave for every viewer to consider. If your rights were challenged, how far would you go to reclaim them?